Have you ever heard of the story of the time when journalist Daniel Voss almost went mad, thinking that he was hearing the voices of the dead? Well, he stated that just after midnight, he felt human hands reach up through the ground and press against his bare feet. He said that he could feel the fingers, thumbs, palms. He was standing in the garden of this house. It was the 12th night of a 2-week stay, and he said that in that instance, he clearly heard the voices of the dead. Some of you may recognize this story. It's been touted as Killer Granny's boarding house. This little old lady, Dorothea Puente, now get this, killed and buried 7 of her boarders in the backyard of this house. And now Daniel Voss was standing directly above the area where she had buried them, hearing this cry from the dead for help. And this was something, because Daniel had not come to this house as a ghost chaser. No, he had come here as a journalist to write about what happens to murder houses once all of the cameras pack up and go home. He had met the property manager at exactly 4:47 p.m., noted it in his journal. I personally like this case because Daniel took a ton of notes. Well, she handed him the key with his professional efficiency, and then she offered this ominous warning. No one ever stays long, she says. 4 tenants, 3 years, and 2 of them left on the very first night. What? Was she trying to scare him? Well, Daniel didn't scare that easily. No, this was almost routine to him. See, he had been to many places involving crime. Courtrooms, prisons, bloody crime scenes, and he sure wasn't going to be afraid of a measly old boarding house. At least, that's what he thought.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
Daniel Voss was a journalist who chased stories that exposed fractures in society. He wrote about true crime that had been a result of systems that had failed the most vulnerable among us. At 42 years old, he had already spent 15 years doing this, and he had already published 2 books on crime in the community. He was the kind of man who believed that if one stayed long enough and listened hard enough, the truth would eventually speak. What he didn't know was that this time the truth had already been waiting for someone to arrive, and when it spoke, it would do so with real audible voices from people who had already died. Well, Daniel took the keys and he stepped through the front door. And up until that point, everything had seemed normal. But once he crossed the threshold and closed the door behind him, the silence was different than anything he had experienced before. It had weight. He said later that it actually pressed against his chest when he breathed. Whatever that means. I have a difficult time seeing how silence can literally press against someone's chest, but okay. Those were his exact words, by the way. Well, after he adjusted to this heaviness, he said that he walked the house slowly, room by room, making a mental map of the place and noting the exits. Front room, kitchen, hallway, stairs, up to the large bedroom on the 2nd floor, the bathroom, and the small back room that overlooked the garden. That, of course, is where he stopped. He looked out at the garden for just a second. By the way, that's where all the bodies had been buried. And then he noticed about chest high, there was this single horizontal scratch in the plaster below the window. It was about 6 inches long. Well, it wasn't exactly a scratch because it was protruding. It was as if something on the inside of the wall were scratching outward. Well, he found it so bizarre that he took out his phone and he photographed it, and then he took a second and notated it.
Mark on west wall. Back bedroom? Pre-existing? Or...
Daniel really wasn't sure how to finish that sentence, so he didn't. Well, the rest of the day was uneventful, and that night he poured himself a scotch and he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark garden. The grass was flat and ordinary. It was hard for him to imagine that that was where she had buried those bodies. Well, he noted that it looked so innocent. A few hours later, he went upstairs to get his jacket. Now, check this out. Do you remember that mark that he found on that wall, that protrusion? While in the process of getting his jacket, he glanced at the wall and he noticed that it looked considerably longer. What? Well, that didn't seem right. So he took out his phone, found the photo, and he held his phone up to the wall. And sure enough, the line had somehow grown. It was almost twice as long. While the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and then the feeling of being alone hit him. But then he thought about it for a second. He didn't know all the inner workings of old houses. Could plaster possibly swell? Could termites maybe cause something like this to happen? In any case, he kept himself calm, went back downstairs, and then he wrote down the time, 11:07 p.m. Then he noted that the mark had somehow extended and that no one else was in the house. Then he paused for a moment, and without really thinking, he wrote, "It's starting." It's starting? What's starting? I tell you guys know that I'm skeptical at heart, but this story is creepy. If only half of what he reported about this case is true, well, then this is one chilling case. For the next couple of nights, nothing else really happened. Maybe a creak here or a strange sound there, but nothing that one wouldn't expect in an old house. But there was something about being alone in that house that made it difficult for him to sleep. So each evening he found himself sitting up reading case notes late into the night. And then on the third night, in the early morning hours, he heard someone else in the house with him. The floorboards just above him began creaking. It started with a single step. So he got out his notebook and he noted the time, 1:47 a.m. And then there was another step, and another. Someone was upstairs, walking across the floor in the room directly above him. But that didn't make any sense at all. How did someone get into the house? Surely he would have seen the person come through the front door and then go up the stairs, right? Well, he grabbed his phone and he went to the bottom of the stairs and he hit record. And at that exact moment, the footsteps stopped. So a few seconds later, he called out, "Who's up there?" But no one answered. And after a short while, he worked up the courage to go upstairs and check it out, but all of the rooms were empty. He did notice, however, and I thought that this was creepy as hell, the unmistakable outline of a bare footprint on the wooden floor as it was slowly dissipating. Creepy, right? Well, finding no one up there, and with no other reason to stay upstairs, he surely wasn't going to sleep. He went back downstairs and resumed his reading. Then, just 20 minutes later, he heard the footsteps again. Well, this time, they walked to the area of the ceiling that was directly above his head, and then just stopped. So, Daniel took out his phone and he hit record. And for 11 straight minutes, something stood perfectly still on the floor above him. Well, Daniel didn't move at all. He said later that some part of him knew with absolute certainty that whatever was up there was listening to him in the same way that he was downstairs listening to it. Well, nothing ever did become of those footsteps. And then on day 5, the smell arrived. This organic rot that filled the kitchen while he was making breakfast. So he spent nearly 2 hours checking every inch of the house. The crawl space directly under the kitchen was the worst. It was only 3 foot high, and that's definitely where the stench was coming from. But he found nothing down there that could have been creating that odor. So he marked it in his notebook and then he went on about his day. Later that evening, while he was reading the 1988 forensic report, he noticed at the bottom of the second page there was this note about the soil. Now, I thought this was insanely creepy. In the areas immediately surrounding and above the internments, soil composition showed unusual organic enrichment, consistent with prolonged biological decomposition. Well, the smell eventually became overwhelming, rolling through the house in waves.
The ground under this house has been changed by what was put into it. It remembers. And the house is trying to tell me this. It is saying, look at the ground beneath you. Look at what was asked of it.
At this point, Daniel was still trying to find rational explanations for these strange occurrences. But whatever was in this house was just getting started. And that thing pressing against the plaster in the upstairs room? Well, soon it would manifest in the form of something pressing outside, up through the soil, in the garden. Sometime during the seventh night, something new clawed its way into the darkness. Voices. They came as whispers in rooms that he wasn't in. The low, urgent murmuring of conversation just below the edge of understanding. The rhythm and breath of people talking, the pauses, the rises, the falls, all of it drifting through the walls and floors as if the house itself were carrying the sound. Well, Daniel went to the source every time, and every time he found an empty room and a silence that felt even heavier than before. And had he not been recording, perhaps he might have thought that this was all just in his mind. But he had been recording. And later he sat at the kitchen table, listening over and over, and finally, through the would-be whispers, he made out a name. Leona. Well, he went to the case file, and sure enough, he found her. Leona Carpenter, 78 years old, one of the 7 buried in the garden. So he kept listening, and soon he made out more names. Dorothy, James, George, all victims who had been buried in the garden. So what? The dead were speaking their own names? Why? Well, he marked it down as something to ponder and then went on. On the 10th day, more marks appeared. Remember that room overlooking the garden? Well, more protrusions appeared in the wall, barely noticeable. But Daniel took his chime and he pulled out another name, Benjamin Fink. The case files listed Benjamin Fink as a tenant of the boarding house who went missing. Forensically, he couldn't be matched to any of the bodies in the garden. Nevertheless, Dorothea was convicted of his murder. But it was all very clinical, circumstantial. Benjamin Fink was treated more like a piece of evidence than a human being whose life had been ripped away from him. Well, with that, Daniel knelt down at the wall and then spoke the name out loud. Benjamin Fink, I found you. And now, check this out. The very moment that those words left his mouth, the floor beneath his palm turned warm. Not gradually, no, instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. Then a few seconds later, it slowly faded. Daniel sat there stunned. And then he wrote in his notebook, in large capital letters, he wanted to be found. By this point, Daniel was having a very difficult time making sense of what was happening. Remember, he was just a journalist. He was no ghost chaser. Was his mind playing tricks on him? You know, those footsteps, well, they had stopped as soon as he went upstairs to investigate. And the whispering voices? Well, they were just murmurs until he sat and listened to them for hours. Only then did they begin to speak the names of the dead. But the floor, no. The floor had definitely turned warm in direct response to him saying the name Benjamin Fink out loud. Well, Daniel was beginning to lose his grip on the crime story that he had originally come here to write.
Day 12. Doubt. Am I the right person to witness this? Or am I exactly the wrong one?
Later that night, while Daniel lay in bed, he was consumed with this overpowering urge to get up and go out into the garden. Moments later, he found himself barefoot, standing on the grass directly above where the bodies had been buried. The moon was giving just enough light to make the garden look eerily silver and black. "I'm here," he said to the ground. "What do you want?" And then, nothing. Just a continuing song of the crickets in the distance. But just as he was about to go back into the house, the ground moved. It actually dropped about a half an inch or so, as if the soil were giving way to something beneath it. His body dropped with it. Well, he froze, and then he felt it. Pressure, upward, against the soles of his feet, coming straight through the cold grass and the earth below. The unmistakable sensation of human hands pressing against the bottoms of his feet. You could feel the palms, thumbs, fingers, specific, localized, desperate. Well, at that moment, every fiber of his being screamed, "Run!" But he couldn't. No. Part of him was consumed with this overwhelming sense of grief. Then he began to shake, and he dropped to his knees. His open palm touched the grass, and then instantly, like a jolt of electricity, he heard the voices of the dead. Clear, distinct, desperate.
Find us, Daniel! Find us all!
And in that moment, the pressure beneath his palms intensified. One final push, and then it stopped. And instantly, the grass went completely still. The earth was just earth again, and the night was cold and quiet. And in that moment, he found himself crying, wrapped deeply into the emotion of unending grief. Well, he stayed there for a few more moments, then he went inside and wrote in his journal.
12:47 a.m., the garden. Physical pressure. Hands reaching up, through the soil. Voices from the ground. Find us. Find us all. Something about this house is alive, and it's asking for help.
Daniel wasn't able to sleep after the garden spoke. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the words still vibrating through his bones. Find us, Daniel. Find us all. On the 13th day, he woke up with a single purpose. He cleaned the house. Not because it was his to maintain, but rather because it felt like respect. He washed every surface. He mopped the floors. He cleared the table of the case files and the coffee cups, and he put everything back into order. He vacuumed the hallway and the front room with particular care. In that small room upstairs overlooking the garden, he swept the boards, cleaned the window inside and out, and then ran his fingers along the full length of those marks that had grown over the last 2 weeks. "I found you," he whispered. Not just to Benjamin Fink, no, to all of them. And then he continued, "And I'm going to make sure that the world knows your names." And then he sat down and he wrote for 5 hours straight, turning everything that he had witnessed into a single coherent story, the one that I'm sharing with you right now. 7 names, 7 lives, the lives that the official record had reduced to simply evidence. Well, that night, the 14th and final night, the house came alive. Daniel was at the kitchen table going through his final notes when the temperature dropped and that horrible organic odor intensified into the putrid smell of rotting flesh. "Okay," Daniel said out loud. "You've got my attention. I'm listening." And at that very moment, the back door gently swung open all by itself, slowly, deliberately. And then from the upstairs came footsteps. Not one set this time. No, multiple. The upper hallway filled with the sounds of people walking with purpose. Maybe the way that a normal house sounds when it's fully occupied. And then Daniel got it. And he went to the kitchen doorway, and with genuine love and empathy, he began to speak the names that he had uncovered over the last 2 weeks. Dorothy Miller. Well, the pen on the table slowly rolled, deliberately from one side of the notebook to the other. Benjamin Fink. From the back room upstairs came a single clicking sound, like a door closing, or maybe a lock engaging, or perhaps a sentence that was finally finished. Leona Carpenter. No sound at all, but a cold breeze gently caressed his face, and for a few seconds he got the faint, unmistakable scent of fresh paper and ink, as though a letter had just been written. James Gallup. Well, with that, the footsteps upstairs abruptly stopped, and for several seconds there was absolute stillness. Then, one deliberate footstep, the sound of a man who had been waiting in the hallway and was finally able to move. Vera Faye Martin. Well, the light above the kitchen table dimmed to half brightness and stayed that way before returning to full. Alvaro Montoya. Nothing visible, but Daniel felt it on his right hand, the unmistakable sensation of another human hand holding his. It stayed for several seconds, and then it lifted. Then he took a deep breath. And George Tanner. To all of you, I know that the record got it wrong. Treated you like numbers. Well, I'm taking all of your memories with me, and I'll make sure that your names are told. You can let go now." And at that, there was this long silence. Then, from somewhere in the house that he couldn't locate, from the air itself came two quiet syllables, so faint that he barely heard them. "Thank you." I stood motionless. The pressure that had filled that house for 14 nights slowly began to subside, kind of like the way that a tide recedes from the shore. The smell faded, cold warmed, and the weight lifted. After a moment, the house was entirely quiet. Not the heavy, watchful type of quiet that it had been the previous nights. No, the type of quiet of something that had, at last, put something down. When Daniel made tea and he sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning. Then he went to bed, and for the first time since he arrived, he turned off the hall light. The boarding house had finally let Daniel go, or perhaps Daniel had let the house go. Either way, something had been released that night. But sometime later, in his quiet apartment in Oakland, the house would connect with Daniel one last time. Daniel left on a Thursday morning, and strangely, the house looked exactly as it had the day that he had arrived. Cream paint, rusted gate, mismatched porch posts. The garden lay flat underneath the October sun, and Daniel stood at the gate for a long time, trying to find the right words, but they escaped him. He had made a promise, though. He would write this story, every word of it, keeping it completely factual, knowing that just about everyone would think he was crazy. Still, the world would know then that these 7 individuals who had been murdered in this house were more than just evidence. They were people. Well, Daniel kept his promise, and shortly after the book was published, he woke up in his Oakland apartment just after 3 a.m. It was quiet, but the hall light was on, and he had not left it on. Well, he got up and he looked around. The doors and windows were all locked from the inside. Then he noticed it. A small horizontal mark about chest high, a protrusion coming out of the wall. Something had followed him home, and for just a moment his heart raced, but then a feeling of calm and gratitude washed over him. He had written the book, and the dead were grateful. Now, I know that many of you don't want to hear a skeptical side to this story, so hang on, because Amy is going to be on in just a minute, and she's got a completely different take than I do. First, let me say that Daniel Voss is a pseudonym. He's a fictional character that doesn't even exist. The true writer of this story is an author named A.J. Holloway. In the book, Holloway says this about Daniel Voss.
The central character of this book, Daniel Voss, is a fictionalized version of myself. His experiences in the house reflect my own investigation of the site, but I've given him a name in some fictional distance because the events he describes are sufficiently strange that I wanted the latitude to present them as experiences rather than as claim. Everything Daniel does in this book, I did. Everything he hears, feels, and sees, I heard, felt, and saw.
So make of that what you will. Also, the current long-term owners, Barbara Holmes and Tom Williams, have occupied the house since 2010, and they've repeatedly stated that they feel absolutely nothing unusual in the house, and that as far as they're concerned, it most certainly is not haunted. And I've said it before, old houses creak, pipes shift. How strong is the power of suggestion? You know, many people familiar with this case argue, and quite compellingly, I might add, that what Daniel Voss experienced was the result of 2 weeks of extreme sleep deprivation, constant immersion in graphic case files, and the psychological weight of living alone in one of Sacramento's most infamous crime scenes with the knowledge that 7 bodies had been buried just outside. Now, on the other hand, some people who have spent time in that house tell a completely different story. Juanita Holmes, for example, Barbara's mother, lived downstairs for a few years, and she reported seeing the ghost of an elderly woman moving about the house. And history is full of accounts of murder victims whose spirits seem to refuse to rest until they've been properly acknowledged, right? From the ghosts who help solve their own murder cases to the persistent hauntings reported from sites of mass trauma, one pattern seems to repeat. When the dead are buried without ceremony, without mourning, without anyone willing to say their names as human beings rather than just case numbers, well, they often find ways to demand attention, don't they? The boarding house is quieter now, and whether that quiet comes from a mind that is finally allowed to rest, or from something long unmourned that's finally been heard, I would think that the answer matters less than the question that it leaves behind. If some poor murdered souls of heinous, unspeakable crimes really do occasionally need to be acknowledged, well then, who among us are brave enough to stay long enough and listen?
Damon mentioned the author using a pseudonym, and honestly, I don't think that takes away any credibility. See, the author wanted to write about his experience without having to guard his words. I would argue that using a pseudonym freed the author up to be brutally honest in sharing his experiences. Also, Holloway didn't throw around vague, spooky language. Instead, he documented the little things, and he was very specific. So specific, in fact, it seems impossible to make it up. The footsteps stopped when Daniel listened. The voices only became clear when he sat with them. The house didn't perform on command, and that subtlety is exactly what makes me believe him more. It felt less like a man hunting for the conjuring moment, and more like a man who stayed still long enough to hear something that most of us would probably run from. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. Not that the dead were speaking, but that they were waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And speaking of patiently listening, listen to this. Did you know that supporting Damon and I on Buy Me a Coffee is super fun? Well, it is. You should try it. And it really helps us as we create these videos. You can support us by buying us a few virtual coffees or by becoming a monthly member. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back next week with another interesting mystery.